Well, thank you for having me. It's always an honor, and I appreciate you mentioning the photos in my office. And my favorite photo is just a happenstance shot of a tail gunner of a Black Hawk, silhouetted by the moon over Jalalabad. And what I love most about going downrange, and we went and supported units in Afghanistan, is being with the men and women at the sharp end of the spear, right? I mean, you can hang out in Washington, D.C. all you want, but unless you're sitting with a staff sergeant from a special forces team out in some far-flung location, I mean, that's the best. And I kind of see this opportunity to talk with you as somewhat like that, right? You're all working the sharp end of the spear here, and I'm just really grateful to be able to talk with you, engage with you, answer any questions you might have. And my assumption is I'm going to probably come away learning more by the questions you ask and the conversations than probably what you'll get out of this. So anyway, I appreciate you coming here. I'll talk to you about two studies today that we did looking at violent extremism in America. This first one here is looking at the results of interviews that we did, in-depth interviews that we did with individuals who, most of whom were either formers, people who used to be extremists and then they reformed, or family and friends of those who died during terrorist operations. So anyway, happy to be able to present this research to you here. Let's see if I can figure this out. All right, well, we know that violent extremism is a growing issue here in the United States. I don't have to tell an audience in El Paso about that with the recent attack at the Walmart. So you all know firsthand what the consequences of these types of trends are. But obviously, it's not just El Paso, it's Pittsburgh, it's Buffalo, and even in my own hometown, Washington, D.C., had its own sort of traumatic incident with the attack on the U.S. Capitol. So these problems are certainly rising. And obviously here are just some of the high-profile cases that we talked about. Given all these things and the concerns that we have and the research that we've sort of done over the years, we had several sort of key questions that we wanted, that policymakers and researchers are committed to try and answer. One is risk and contributing factors. What are the risks? What risks are common among individuals who engage in extremist behavior? How do individuals become radicalized? And how do individuals become de-radicalized, right? We know that violent extremism is not a one-way street. Many people, in fact, come back from this. And so understanding how we can bring people back from that brink is really a key question. And in this research, we wanted to ask another question, and that is what strategies are effective for preventing violent radicalization or promoting de-radicalization? And so these are the broad questions that we tried to ask in this research. And this last one I'll note, particularly we sought the advice of some of the former extremists that we talked with. So we really wanted to ask them what they thought were relevant mitigation strategies. So what we did was we interviewed either 36 former extremists, actually 36 former extremists and their family and friends. There were 32 cases overall, 32 individuals. Let's see, what's this next one here? 32 cases that we looked at. Most of these were white supremacists, neo-Nazis and that variety, and then a small number, about 8, were Islamic extremists. And we modeled the study on what's called the psychological autopsy approach. One way, and this is what you do when you study suicide, because when you study suicide, the person you want to study is dead. So the way you do this is to understand what prompted them, what their background is, what their risk factors were for committing suicide, is you do interviews with their family and friends. And so we started out this process thinking that that would be the central approach that we would use. We'd be talking mostly to family and friends of people who were either incarcerated or killed. But in fact, we discovered a very large and vibrant community of what's called formers, these former violent extremists. And I'll talk to you about 4 sort of key things on this brief. And again, please interrupt me if you have any questions. We're sort of quite used to that and prefer it oftentimes. But one, looking about what are the risk factors, what things appeared to make this sample of individuals unique? And the second question is, what were the pathways in? How did they get there? What was their radicalization trajectory? And third, how'd they get out? A lot of these people got out. So how did they get out? And are they out? Did they stay out or not? And what mitigation strategies, and then what mitigation strategies. And this is where we sort of learn from the violent extremists themselves as to what should have happened maybe to prevent their fall, their radicalization. So, all right, so let's start off. Financial instability. The majority of these cases, about 2/3, suffered financial problems. These people are probably not the sharpest end of the stick. They're not the most squared away, so to speak, and partly how they get trapped into this world. But financial challenges served as a driver toward extremism for some of these people. Other people talked about struggling to keep work, to keep a job. Others had to get a job in the extremist organizations themselves to stay employed, and which is partly how they joined. And you see his quote in the center here. This is an individual, a former military guy. He said, with 11 years in the military, I should be able to get a job on base no problem as a contractor. No, that didn't happen. So I decided to blame my problems on somebody else and say it's black people's fault. There's also another individual that gave us a story about how he was suffering from being, well, I'll save that story for the next slide. So this person talks about learning disabled, but others suffered from depression. There were a number of prior suicide attempts in our sample. So a lot of, okay, wait, I got my slides mixed up. So now mental health. So half of these cases have mental health problems. We look at the general population, about 15% or so in the general population have current mental health issues. About 20% have lifetime mental health problems. Our sample, it was over half. You see this very typically in a lot of different samples of former violent extremism where past issues of mental health problems were common. Here, individuals learning disorder, the military won't take me. Like, I've been denied numerous jobs, and that's like something I've always struggled with in my life. Another guy told us, one person told us, one person described talking to a friend of his in school about his emotional struggles and his relationship problems that he was having. And the individual sort of looked at him and said, I think I might be able to help. And he pulled out a flyer from his book bag and he said, I belong to this organization and this is a lobby for people like us, people with European descent and backgrounds. So a lot of sort of histories of mental challenges in this population. And then social factors, just factors that prevented people from getting along and building relationships with other people. People report being victimized, being stigmatized and marginalized in society. Here, one person, this is an individual who's of South Asian descent, and they sought to join, I think, ISIS. But they're brown, and they say, I always think that a lot of racism is not even from some white people, but from other minority groups for being South Asian, for being Muslim. Things that I didn't even choose, but I was hated for those things. So in this case, this sort of background of racism and that experience sort of led them on that path. So pathways in, let's talk a little bit about how people get in. So reorienting events was noted in about half the cases. So what's a reorienting event? Reorienting event is something that happens, it's something you see a lot in religious conversion. In other words, people suffer some sort of break in their life, an emotional problem, a suicide attempt, a lost job, some sort of traumatic event that causes them to rethink and reopen their eyes to, yeah.
Related to this slide and then a couple slides back, is there any particular reason that you noted in the research that people were blaming other races? Because it would seem to me with financial and job issues, a lot of those problems would also be instigated by people within their same racial group.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of variability in this. In this case, that was a sort of a quote from someone who's South Asian, and that's their story, their narrative of how they ended up becoming radicalized, is that perception of it. But and that's their experience. Like in that case, they were experiencing racism from other groups, from other minority groups. That's not always the problem, of course, and I wouldn't say that most or many or a high majority of people suffer that same type of experience. I mean, one of the challenges you get with studying violent extremism work is just the heterogeneity, right? I mean, people do things for all sorts of different reasons, all sorts of different backgrounds, and I used to think of it like why people go to college, right? Why'd you pick your college? And you can say like, well, I know why I picked my college, well, because my brothers went there, and so I grew up with that. But you're just trying to recall that experience. The other factors may have been at play, and that's just one person. So it's hard to sort of, you got to be really careful in how you sort of look at the trends and sort of draw conclusions. But that's their story. Yeah.
The education level of some of these folks, was that one of the factors that you guys looked at as well?
Yes. I know others have. I know the George Washington Center has looked at, has done work looking at the Capitol rioters. There's a rich data source on the Capitol rioters because many of them have been picked up by the feds. And so there's rich court records. And I know that organization's looking at them. In fact, if anybody's interested, we're holding a symposium. I'm running my own symposium this Thursday online with one of the participants in that is the researcher who's looking at all those court records and looking at the motivational factors of the Capitol rioters. So I'll share that with, he can sort of share that with the crowd if he's interested. So, yeah.
What was the process to identify and reach out to these folks?
Yeah, good question. We worked with organizations. So Parents for Peace is an organization that seeks to do engagements, de-radicalization engagements with potential extremists. So they run a helpline that people can call, like if you have a friend or neighbor or something that was experiencing problems with QAnon or white supremacy or whatever, then you can call this hotline and they will talk with you and work with you about how to engage that person to sort of bring them out. Which fits with some of our data that show a lot of the people get out through family and friend networks and the engagements and actual like literal interventions that happen with family members to help bring them out. So anyway, we work with that organization. They have a big network of folks. And then we also worked with the former leader of the National Socialist Movement, Jeff Shope, and he runs a group called Beyond Barriers. And so he's like sort of turned his career from running the National Socialist Movement, a neo-Nazi group, to helping people get out of extremism. So they sort of have their own networks that we can sort of draw on for this. And then, of course, when we interviewed folks, we'd ask them if there are others that we could talk to. So, question? Yeah.
Just of the cases, do you have like a breakdown, I guess, where in the country they're located? Are they, and where they spread out throughout the country, people you talk to?
That's a good question. I don't have that. Partly because we wanted to ensure confidentiality of the folks that we talked to. I think we were wary of listing their hometown locations, but maybe we should have done that. I forget, but we did. I don't think we did.
And then of the groups, I know it just says former white supremacists, but do you have a breakdown of like which group they identified with? Or
possibly in our report. I'll look at that and get back to you at the break. Yeah, the breakdown falls into like there's sort of differences, variations on a difference, right? They're neo-Nazis, neo-Nazi versus white supremacists versus KKK. There's certainly different flavors of it, but I'm not sure we catalog those different flavors. Yeah.
Have you seen the media to be any sort of influence on any of these groups?
Pardon?
Have you seen the media to be any sort of influence in any of these groups?
A positive influence?
No, an influence just in them.
Radicalization influence. Well, certainly. One thing is I'll talk about next. In fact, I'll come back to reorienting and hit this part real quick and see if this answers your question. I can't say whether or not Fox News or CNN is radicalizing people. I know that, and I will say here, 2/3 of people talked about propaganda. And the way we did this is we asked people just to share their story. We didn't come at this with a list of 30 questions. Like, did you have propaganda? What were the top five propaganda you looked at? We didn't ask that. We asked people just to sort of self-describe. They basically told their story, which is, I think, an interesting approach because the story you tell is the story that's important to you. and we didn't impose questions on them. So I will almost guarantee that 120% of the sample consumed propaganda before they joined their group. It's almost a rule. It's almost a rule, right? But 2/3 of the folks described their propaganda, like made a point of talking about their propaganda experience. And of course, a lot of these people are coming in from the internet. Let me see if I have a quote here. So this one guy says, "One observed in hanging out in online chat rooms, I would stay on there all night and then started making friends there, meeting up, and then that was kind of like my only friends I had." So, that's certainly an example. So the social media was key. A lot of these people read books. In the neo-Nazi community, books, like actual literature, is sort of an important thing. So the 88 Precepts, Mein Kampf, those sort of stories are important. Music is huge. Like white power music is really a huge thing. And all these things play together, right? It's not just you're looking at propaganda by yourselves. Propaganda is an inherently social act. So you're not just, watching online propaganda. You're interacting, as this person would talk about, right? You're interacting on Facebook groups. You're interacting in chat groups. You're going to white power music events, and so the white power music event becomes a sort of social sphere in and of itself. So those are the types of stories that they would tell us about the propaganda. Yeah.
Were demographics and upbringing brought into this call?
In what way?
In what way, like were they brought up in a poor community? Was that the environment they were raised in? Was it just something that they happened to find online? Was that something that was spouted by their parents?
Yeah, I don't have a breakdown in numbers, partly because the sample is small, so I can't say 20% of anything, right? And we didn't tabulate the numbers on those things per se. But yes, people would describe that. Part of it comes from the data I mentioned earlier, where a lot of these people came from financially difficult backgrounds. Some were financially difficult issues when they were adults. Some refer to them when they were younger. But I don't have an exact number. No. Gonna really scan here. All right, so that's the propaganda thing. Let's see, can I go back? How do I go back? Let's see if I can. Okay, so others talked about these reorienting events. As I mentioned before, this is common in conversion literature, where in the conversion world, where if you want to get someone to convert to your church or something like that, the best time to probably do that is when they're suffering some sort of problem, because that allows them to sort of rethink their world and they're open to these new ideas, and we saw that a lot in these cases. And this one guy tells the story, tells the story of he had this long run up to the story about how he was going to move to the big city. I think to him the big city was Minneapolis. So he was going to move to the big city of Minneapolis, and he was really excited. He was moving out of his parents' home, and he just had it all set. He had an apartment, he had a job, and it all fell apart on him. And he was just like emotionally crushed when he gets back. And he says. And he said he started to reevaluate everything in his life. He started to reevaluate religion in his life. And he says, I kind of got in this mindset, what else have I been lied to about? And something about the whole antisocial nature of the Third Reich appealed to me. And that's a really common story that you get. Another guy was, a Muslim dude was busted by his parents for throwing an alcohol party in his house. And that singular event led him to go to Pakistan. And seek out a very conservative religious movement that ended up bringing him back into the sort of extremist circles back where he was from. So anyway, you see these stories happen a lot. And sometimes it's suicide, sometimes it's a gun charge. I think his name Bledsoe. I want to say Drew Bledsoe, but that's a quarterback. There's another extremist guy who ended up committing murder in, I think, Georgia or something like that. For him, it was a gun charge. He had a gun charge, and the result of that gun charge just basically led him to go to Yemen to study to Islam, study Arabic. He converted, and that was his pathway. So anyway, so propaganda, and then social bonds. Social bonds are huge in this. Terrorism is an inherently social act. We do hear examples of people, lone actors, but I would almost bet most people who are lone actors were interacting with people online, were reaching out to others in one way, shape, or form. And certainly if you're part of an extremist group, That's obviously almost by definition, right? It's a group. It's almost by definition a social thing. But a lot of people told us stories about what that group did for them. And for a lot of people, that group, was it. They came, I mentioned before, these people come in from really crummy social backgrounds. They struggle to make friends. And now all of a sudden there's an extremist circle where they're buddies, they're going to cookouts, they're hanging out. One guy says, I never had been a part of a group that was as tight as this radical group, even though there was a lot of infighting in it, and there's a lot of infighting in these groups. So you go to these rallies and everyone's your brother and everyone's extremely cool and friendly. So it's a very inviting place. It's not only something that brings you in, but it's a reward for being in. And it's a glue that keeps you in, because to leave the group means to leave your friends. All right, so let's talk about path exiting. Any other questions about the pathway, the radicalization process of getting in? Okay. All right, disillusionment and burnout. Here's another quote I wanted to throw at you. So there's socialness, there's social, but there's also power that gets in this. And several folks talked about the power of being in these groups, and I like this quote. People switch the side of the street when they see you. It was a great feeling. Even thinking back, it was a great feeling. Another described a family member's experience as going from feeling undervalued and weak to feeling that sense of power and control. So those factors also play in. But the party doesn't last. And what we see for a lot of these folks, for at least half the cases, is that there was this sort of disillusionment and burnout. There's a lot of folks talked about the hypocrisy and infighting of the group, the ineffectiveness of the group. We're all cited as key drivers of their disillusionment. Many who exited also did so due to exhaustion from the energy needed to maintain the violence, right? It's a very intense life, and it's hard to sort of keep that up for very long. And you get this quote from this one guy, we're out there marching about illegals bringing drugs into our nation, and yet at the same time we're using illegal drugs. All of it just started to seem more and more hypocritical, and it just didn't make sense to me anymore. So, as I mentioned before, interventions were really key. About 22 of the 30 cases highlighted the fact that they experienced some type of intervention in their ability to sort of leave extremism. Most interviews cited, a lot of these interventions were from life partners, friends, former radicals, or acquaintances. 11 cases involved interventions by formal institutions, including programs and organizations that played a role in helping them get out. So a lot of different ways this happened. Some of these interventions were very formal, some were informal, built by building relationships over time. And you see this quote here, and she grabbed me and she hugged me and she said, it's okay, man, it feels good to let it out. And I was like, I'm so sorry. And I just started, I'm getting emotional right now because that was a really important part of my recovery from hate. And that friend's name made it happen. I mentioned, let's see, what's the next slide here? So one of the factors that played a big role in these interventions was exposure to diversity. And of course, this is for the white supremacist folks. But exposure to African Americans, exposure to other minorities that really offset their expectations was a big role in this. And I gave you three prominent examples that I can tell a story about. One involves Jeff Shope, who was a leader of National Socialist Movement. And he was actually a planner and organizer of the Unite the Right rally. And a documentarian had contacted him and wanted to do a documentary of him and his preparation for this conference. And that person, when they arrived, was Dia Khan. Dia Khan, well, she's a minority. She's from Pakistan. But that's fine. They were going to let her film it because they thought it'd be good propaganda value for them. But over time, he built a relationship with Dia Khan. And very soon after doing the event, he realized that his ideology was quite incompatible with the reality of what he experienced in having this relationship with Dia Khan. Another guy, Daryl Davis. Anybody here Daryl Davis? Okay, so you know Daryl Davis. Daryl Davis is an African-American dude who has just made a cottage industry out of building relationships with Ku Klux Klan's members. He invites them to the bar, he hangs out, has drinks with them. And what oftentimes happens is that relationship he builds with them, and oftentimes these guys are meeting with him in secret because they don't want other people in the clan to know that they're having lunch with this African American. But over time, people realize that, again, their ideology is incompatible with what's in front of their eyes. And another guy tells a story about Seinfeld. He loved Seinfeld, and he had all the videos of Seinfeld, but he had to hide them from his wife because Seinfeld's Jewish. So he had to hide all these Seinfeld videos from his wife, and it dawned on him that Seinfeld's Jewish, and he's really funny, and again, that caused him to rethink his experience. So we have a lot of stories, just tons of stories about the sort of role of minorities dealing with the other in helping to push people away from extremism. So what is the difference between a successful intervention and a failed one? Well, I mentioned before, the diverse cultural exposure seemed to be a really big thing for a lot of these people. Emotional support and kindness, not a big surprise, right? You're not going to let someone into your heart and change you who's an asshole. So this sort of notion that people can come in, so Dia Khan didn't build a relationship with Jeff Schultz by being a jerk and by being judgmental and telling him how horrible he was and scum of the earth and what have you. It was quite the opposite, right? So that's how you build relationships, and that was really sort of a key entry point in this. Also, financial and domestic stability seemed to be important for a lot of people, right? Having their sort of life on a track that's gonna allow them, give them an alternative to extremism and give them a means to stay away from it. Now, a lot of the bad interventions were at the hands of family members, friends, authority figures. These oftentimes were heavy-handed, right? You've got to get out of this now, or judgmental, and those things don't work. Which I feel like this notion of the diverse experience and this need for sympathetic engagement with these people, I think is just a real valuable lesson from the study, for me personally. Okay, let's talk about some mitigation strategies. So what did our participants tell us about what were their recommendations? One is that you have to address the marginalization and deepening polarization. So exposure to diversity seems to be a big thing. So a lot of the participants highlighted the need to expose people to diversity at early ages. So that's one suggestion. Another suggestion is this need of providing safe spaces for alternative viewpoints. Let's see, as the quote here. So here, a lot of these individuals have views, maybe conservative views that many in society would deem sort of antithetical, right? And so when they receive punishments across society for having these viewpoints, they want safe spaces to have these views. How can they safely talk about these things? And here the guy says, we really need to have some kind of resource in schools that addresses the politically incorrect questions that people like me had. Questions like, why is it that we're making a big fuss about Chinese New Year and we don't make a fuss about European holidays, right? These things shouldn't be taboo. There should be ways to talk about these things. Diverse people and ideas, develop critical thinking skills. So a lot of people talking about the value of media literacy, about the need to develop critical thinking skills, about the role of education in this. This addressing in childhood is really key. Most of these people's stories about radicalization started when they were kids. And then, of course, mental health problems. There are, as I highlighted before, mental issues are common in this group. Interestingly, so there's an organization called Moonshot, and they have they've done work. They do online engagements with people, and what they do is they identify people doing Google searches for extremism. How do I join KKK? Or where is KKK chapter? Or whatever you might Google when you're in that situation. And they post. What they do is they use Google Ads, right? So they post ads to people Googling these things. And what they found is when those ads give people a resource, a mental health line to contact, those individuals are 60% more likely to call that mental health line than normal non-extremists. They're over 120% more likely to call that helpline if they're trying to join an extremist group. So, yes, mental health engagement, find some way to give people is really key. This quote here talks about someone who wanted treatment but couldn't afford it, and that was sort of his downfall. And then warning signs. So a lot of the folks in our sample had warning signs about their radicalization process. For Islamic extremists, oftentimes it meant this sort of deepening religious conversion that separated them more from society, separated them from their family, led them to be more judgmental. For right-wing folks, a lot of times it's consuming propaganda. It's it's seeing your kid with a neo-Nazi symbol, or seeing your kid reading Mein Kampf, which most people would be like, well, no crap. Of course, that's a pretty bad sign. A lot of the parents of these guys didn't get it, and so they would let those things slide. So. All right, some recommendations. All right, one, talk about scaling up homegrown interventions. Exposure to diversity. It seems really clear that exposure to diversity helps bring people out of extremism. But there's a question, does it prevent people from going into extremism? So to us, that's a really critical question. And we argue, and I'll talk about this in the next brief, but we do argue that there needs to be some way of sort of helping bridge that cultural, ethnic divide at some sort of earlier age. Mentored spaces for disagreement. Can we find opportunities to give people safe spaces to share the concerns they have without repercussion? The need for media literacy, strategies that help educate people to avoid or to critically consume media so they're not falling into the lies that are out there. Outreach via social networks. I mentioned Moonshot, CVE, they do online interventions. So when someone says, how do I join KKK? They can put an ad in there that says, here's a helpline for mental health care. And if they do call that line, now they're talking to a counselor. That provides an opportunity for that counselor to talk to them about their experience. I know Moonshot's also tried putting ads out that would say how do I join ISIS? And they show you a video of how terrible ISIS is, right? Like the true experience of ISIS. And they would show that content to those folks. I'm not sure how effective that is. They're definitely moving more now to the online counseling and engagement space. So these are just a few of the things that we talk about. Also the need for improved screening to sort of detect people or detect who suffer from these ideologies or to help family members address them. Policy trade-offs, this notion of hard versus soft engagement, and a lot of these people committed crimes. And of course, if you're committing crimes, then if you're caught for those crimes, you need to pay the price for that. And no one's arguing that that's not the case. But there is a need socially from a societal level to be more open and engaging with these folks so they can be brought back out of it. And I know that it's a trade-off that we've suffered with the Islamic extremism, where a lot of family members and friends saw individuals, sons, daughters, starting to radicalize, and they called the FBI. Well, what's the first thing the FBI did? The FBI starts an investigation, and investigations inherently lead toward prosecution. And so now they're prosecuting these kids, and the parents are like, well, that was not what I intended when I called you. And so now a lot of people in the communities were saying, well, we're not going to call the FBI anymore because the FBI are just going to put this heavy-handed law enforcement approach. So there's a challenge with that. Promoting assistance for families and friends, and expanding mental health care. There's probably a need to expand mental health care. It's challenging, though, because there's only a few people in the population are suffering from these types of ills, and expanding mental health care is obviously expensive. That is, I think, something that they're looking to do to address school shooters. And doing it in a targeted way on the online system, I think, is helpful. Here's an interesting point of fact. Moonshot just did a study, and they looked at people Googling school shootings in state of California. 40,000 searches were done on school shootings in the state of California. 30% of those had an affinity for the shooter. Which seems to suggest a very large number of people who are turned on by these events. But also it provides, so that's scary, but the good part is that provides an opportunity for intervention. And then we talk about some further research, but I'll just pause there and address any questions.
I've got a couple of questions. When you look at the research and you talk about the policy implications and mental health and all that, is there a look at in terms of funding streams as to who's doing mental health right now? How's that funded? At the state, local level, federal level?
I don't know. I do know that there is an interesting intervention program that's going right now that's being tested. It's funded by DHS, I think, where they are looking at sort of geographic hotspots where extremism rates are high. Extremism rates either in hate crime rates or other types of online indices where communities might be suffering high rates of extremism, and then going into those communities and looking what services and programs are available for that type of audience. So we're looking to see what is the counseling, how available is mental health care, how available is support for employment and things like that. And so they're basically, I think it's a really interesting approach. It's a very structural approach. Realizing we can't provide mental health care, we probably should, but it's obviously expensive and probably politically prohibitive to provide it everywhere. So let's just identify targeted areas where we can really try to improve services. Yep.
If your subjects being incarcerated, I'm assuming they have access to like psychological profiling from doctors and everything. Is there a trend towards certain personality disorders or antisocial personality disorders, sociopathy that these people are prone to?
So it's interesting. Most our sample is not incarcerated.
Oh, okay.
But it's an interesting question about the sociopathy. In my time in clinical training, I've met one sociopath. I was in grad school, and I was doing intake evaluations at a drug treatment center, and I was doing an interview with this guy, and he was just scary to look at. Sociopaths are a unique type of persona. They don't give a shit about society. They'll do anything to fool anybody, and they don't care about the consequences of what they do. They're not very social. I think it was partly part of the name, right? Antisocial. And extremist groups are inherently social venues. So I don't think antisocials, someone who's a true antisocial, I mean the kind of kid that burned rabbits when he was young and then commits crimes and doesn't care about the consequences that it commits, I don't think that's necessarily the case for these groups. They don't care about the consequences for the other minorities, right? Their view is very sort of tailored to their extremist ideology, but I don't think they would get along well with others in the group. Yeah.
You find these guys are oftentimes inspiring others? And you mentioned that third of those who were doing those online searches were inspired by that. So these whack-a-moles, or whatever, however you want to refer to the sociopaths, they can be an inspiring figure. It could be a religious one under certain guises. And it also seems like there's a strong correlation between the social dynamics that you described in gang or cartel.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Well, I'll come back to this. So 2 questions. The first question, are these guys inspiring? Absolutely, they're inspiring. Yeah. I mean, they're the guy who killed all the, who attacked the mosque in New Zealand in Christchurch. He filmed that live on Facebook. I mean, that video is pornography to these people. And so it's not surprising that you're seeing other attackers follow by trying to live stream their own attacks. And the reason they live stream it is to build an audience, to get everyone sort of worshiping their actions, and it's sort of a way of this sad and unfortunate way of sort of living beyond your life, right? Because these videos will go on in eternity as people watch them. So hugely inspiring, and certainly that's what that 30% statistic I mentioned of people doing searches for school shooters, and they're like, "What music did he listen to? What did he wear? Tell me what he thought." So yes. In terms of your second question was about
the similarities and sociodynamics between like a gang group and a lot of these.
Yeah. There's a lot of research out there that looks at that similarities. So people, I am not well acquainted with that research, other than to say, these gangs are inherently social acts. The social atmosphere probably makes it difficult to leave. It makes it inviting to join. You develop a certain degree of power and prestige by being in it. People walk across the street when they see you, kind of thing. It's a means of employment. So yeah, I think all those factors sort of play in. Yeah.
As far as any type of treatment or help for these folks, most of it is incumbent on them wanting to go in. So we're trying to convince them when we come across these RMVEs, you know, there's stuff out here that they don't even know about. So what recommendations do you have for us to try and steer them into that?
My recommendation would be to get connected with an organization of former extremists, like this Beyond Barriers group, and there's others, or Parents for Peace. Because presumably you're in law enforcement or something like that, right? You can't babysit these guys, so you need to find some way of handing off. And not everybody's open to getting help, right? It's not the right time for everybody. One of the things that our audience participants told us is you got to keep trying. You never know when the time is right, and so it's important for multiple touch points. So in this case, try to find some way of connecting them to some organization that can offer them help, because they could tell you they want help, but you're not probably in a position to help them. And there needs to be some sort of handoff, I would think.
And then when they do go in, they're not going to be held there against their will when they say, I'm done.
Yeah.
I want to leave. So.
Yeah, they definitely won't, right? I mean, they could definitely leave, and for most of these ideologies we're talking about, I mean, all the ideologies, maybe, it's a free country. So, it's tricky. And I would imagine a lot of people will leave before they stay. It's like quitting smoking, right? A lot of studies that show you got to quit smoking a bunch of times before you really learn to quit. So it's probably the same. Yeah.
The 30% that you mentioned, what methods do you guys use to identify that it's some affinity for that event compared to maybe a professional like yourself doing research, and that's why they're digging so deep into the person's past?
So how do you know their affinities? I mean, I don't know. I read the headlines of that study before I came up here and was able to dig in and look at the methods a little bit. My guess is, so the way they do this is they collect online searches. So if you are a commercial entity, say you sell Tide dish soap or something like that, Tide laundry detergent, right? So you go to Google and you tell me, anybody use the word Tide, tell me those searches. And so you can put your geographic area in it, and you can go down to the county or below, and that will tell you who's all using that word in the search. So that's what they do. So they collect all these searches. And generally these searches are relatively short. So many of the searches are people just curious, or they're just looking for true crime kind of stuff. And others, my guess is just the nature of the question that's being asked. If you're asking questions like what music did he like and things like that, that's probably an indication that that there's some affinity there. But I'm not sure how they classified all the different things that they did. Yep.
Did you guys gather data on if incarceration had anything to do with kind of like the default culture in itself, and being incarcerated is like ethnic segregation? Having to stick to your own. Was there any discussion on people saying, I never thought this way until I had to do it because it's what I had to do while I was incarcerated, and that belief stood with me? And then also on the exit way, like certain prisons now are purposely not segregating ethnically, right? You might have to share a cell with someone from a different ethnic background, which forces diversity.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. I haven't thought about that angle of it. I know one person I remember shared their story of incarceration, and in fact, that individual expressly started his own extremist group in prison, partly as a way of being tough and differentiating himself. And that extremist group ended up outliving his extremism, and it's relatively common now, I think, in the prison system. But I don't know. That's a good question. I think my guess is this diversity exposure could be helpful. I imagine it'd be something you want to test out carefully. But in theory, that would be an applicable way of doing that. Yeah.
What was the male to female ratio of your interview? Did you notice any key differences between what men were reporting versus what women were reporting?
There were I'm guessing 4 women in our sample. Too small to make any difference. So yeah, you got a question?
Yes. I'm curious because you mentioned about this intervention and all that program stuff. So I'm wondering whether if you guys have some like assessment tools to identify this person is actually at risk for being a violent extremist or something like that.
Those assessment tools are available, and I don't have them with me, but I know that they're available. I know the Department of Homeland Security does a lot to help train communities to identify and recognize signs and symptoms. So yes, that type of material is available, and I can try and link you to that afterwards.
It's actually the same office that funds this grant.
But different organizations have developed tools for assessing and engaging these people. So, yeah.
So it seems like there's a consistent pattern of these people searching a lot of this on the internet or like YouTube and stuff.
Yeah.
If that is the case, why hasn't there been any censorship? Has there been research onto that? Because I mean, if we see consistent patterns of loner searching this or like, I don't know, it seems like it's easy access, so it's going to continue, but there's no drive to censor these kinds of websites.
So, I mean to censor the actual website content.
Yeah,
So when I search for KKK, I don't get directed to the KKK headquarters. Is that right?
I feel like there's just so much information, right? And if somebody's searching for it, it's so easy to get in touch with these kinds of groups. You have social media, you have different platforms, and it's like, if that's the case, why hasn't there been any censorship towards that, so that people don't have that access? Like, I know it's supposed to give freedom of speech and a lot of our own rights, right? But at what point is it like, okay, we need to do something about it?
Yeah, I think that's the debate. That's like one of the key debates of my field. I was going to say our age, but that might be going a little bit too far. But yeah, that's a key debate right now, right? Is how do you moderate this stuff? Platforms are looking to like Twitter, for example. I think if I started tweeting some incendiary, terribly racist comment with a reference to killing them, my guess is at least there'd be a decent chance that Twitter's algorithm would pick that up and would remove it and possibly, in theory, take away my Twitter privileges, maybe. So that's a big question. And I know Google does this. They do derank. It's called deranking. 90% of people, 95% of the content that people look at on their search engine is on that first page. So removing content from the first page is really sort of a key and powerful tool. So what they'll do is they just push it back and further, so it's harder to look for. My guess is some of the content they can remove from their search engine. My guess is that's a very unlikely avenue for them just because of the censorship concerns. But they do accomplish that with the deranking to some degree. But yeah, that's the big issue. But obviously the fight is what you just said. It's like, well, this is the First Amendment, this is freedom of speech, and you can't do that. And then political groups argue that the platforms are sort of uniquely targeting their political group. So yeah, that's a big issue. A lot of debates. There's another question here.
Todd, in this research, what surprised you the most? Like when you start doing these interviews and start going through that?
The need for radical forgiveness is the way we sort of frame it. That if you want these people to come out, and it's not a surprise, right? I guess maybe if I thought about it, I would have come to this conclusion. But if you want to bring people out, you have to be open and caring on some level, right? Which is not our reaction, which is not how we want to react toward these people. And honestly, I don't know if I would really react that way if some white power dude came in here, right? I can't imagine I'm going to go give him a hug. We're not talking about giving these guys hugs, but having conversations with them, being open with them, talking with them straight up, and expressing your differences. But you can express differences in a carefully calculated way. So anyway, that was probably the biggest surprise, and the role of diversity, I think, was the biggest surprise for me. That this guy named Daryl Davis, he's probably de-radicalized like 30 people just by taking them out for drinks. Yeah.
With the white supremacy groups, how do these individuals
that joining the group they learn to be?
It's a good question. My guess is most of these people are sympathetic to the ideology on some hand, but it's all on a continuum, right? You can be a little sympathetic or a lot sympathetic. And my guess is that the social nature of it, a lot of the ways these guys recruit is through cookouts. They're gonna have a cookout and they invite everybody in the area who's interested in hanging out to hang out, right? And my guess is you need to be sympathetic enough to go to the cookout, but going to the cookout and staying at the cookout and going to the next cookout is gonna make you even more sympathetic, right? So joining an extremist group is an inherently radicalizing act. Like it furthers one's radicalization and cements your position in there. And you probably have to be somewhat sympathetic, but maybe not too sympathetic to attend that first time. That's my guess. Certainly a lot of people are sort of consuming the propaganda fairly significantly before they make that entrance. So, any other questions?
Thank you.
Sure.